So there's a lot of confusion on the regulator side that whenever they see a thing of value going to a referral source, that there's automatically a RESPA
Struck on the
violation.
red light. Woo.
Yeah, I think that's the
Okay.
biggest source of confusion on the regulator side.
Okay.
And I think that there's also confusion with regulators and the industry about co-marketing versus paying for marketing services.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Keys to Real Estate. I'm your host, Mary Schuster. Well, today's guest is noted RESPA expert and industry attorney, Loretta Salzano. She's here to talk about the MBA's recently proposed RESPA reforms. We highlight some key features of the proposed reforms and what they might mean for your market. We also talk about the state of the market today and how the change in administration might affect who might be enforcing which RESPA provisions in the future. Now, if you're not yet familiar with MBA's policy recommendations, a copy is linked in today's show notes. Loretta's here to break it all down for you, so let's get right to it. The presenting sponsor for this season of Keys to Real Estate is Closing Lock. Working in title, do you ever feel like you've got a target on your back? Every year, $2 trillion moves in and out of escrow accounts in the United States. Fraudsters are watching and waiting for one wrong click, one unsecured email, just one oversight. And then just like that, your client's life savings are gone. That's where Closing Lock comes in. Closing Lock provides title companies a secure, all-in-one platform to prevent fraud, protect funds, and streamline closings. Over 1 million home sales have closed safely without incident in Closing Lock. The fraudsters only have to be right once. Title companies have to be right every time. Closing Lock has your back. Visit closinglock.com today to learn more. Loretta Salzano, RESPA expert, welcome to Keys to Real Estate.
Thank you. It's fun to be with you.
Well, we wanted to have you as a guest early in season 2 because the MBA had put out last fall, shortly before the election, a proposal for modernizing RESPA, another round of RESPA reform. And so I wanted to ask you some questions about that proposal today, starting with sort of why now? What might make it a good time or a bad time to look at RESPA reform?
Other than RESPA's birthday? Yeah, that's right. It was the 50th anniversary birthday of RESPA right before MBA annual.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us were reminded it's also the 50th anniversary of ECOA, and they're not getting a rehaul. But I think RESPA Section 8, it's especially important to revisit where things are. And there are a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is it's a less prescriptive law, so there's a lot of room for interpretation. It's particularly fact specific. And as we know, the world has changed a lot in the past 50 years in how mortgage products are marketed and delivered. And so it makes it more difficult to interpret the boundaries of the Section 8 prohibitions. And it also makes it unnecessary, I think, for some of the protections that are in the law, or at least they're a little less urgent. So I think MBA took that opportunity, and now coupled with the change in administration, while I'm not certain how much attention this will garner by Congress and the administration when so many other things are broiling and boiling and bubbling up, but I think that the door is open to a dialogue in a more industry-friendly way than it would have been under the prior administration.
All right, good. Sounds good. Well, so for those who haven't read it, and not to go down deep in it, but what are some of the main areas, main components that MBA are suggesting are ripe for reform?
Sure. So they divide it into different sections. They really start foundationally with blowing out of the water this assumption that the CFPB and even state regulators have that they don't really have to prove the elements of a RESPA Section 8 violation before asking parties to defend their practices under one of the exceptions. And that's been especially problematic. You know, we always tell our clients that even if what you're doing doesn't technically violate RESPA Section 8A or B, anytime a regulator sees you as a mortgage professional or a title professional giving anything of value to anybody out there in the world that could influence your selection, then you better be prepared to demonstrate why there's an exception, because regulators are just going to jump to the conclusion that there's an illegal arrangement. So that's one of the things that they start with foundationally. And then they focus on certain practices and certain, I guess, just industry practices and different exceptions. So one of the exceptions, we all rely upon is the 8C2 exception for marketing service agreements and for desk rentals. Just at a very high level, one of the points of advocacy is to come up with some more appropriate valuation tools for these models. So we're going to carve out and say it is okay to pay people to market you, and certainly you can occupy the space of somebody who is part of or near referral sources, but instead of just looking to general market values, we're going to come up with values that are more appropriate based on the influence that these parties could have. And whether that means proximity to captive buyers or making exceptions for targeted marketing that isn't face-to-face consumer communications and demonstrating that that isn't a referral when we have so much technology able to determine who might be better targets for marketing. And similarly in the real estate space, to consider how the ability of that or how the location of that space would put the tenant in front of captive audiences or referral sources. And their example is, and the MBA's example, thinking of how powerful it is to market or put your space next to a dentist office versus, for instance, a real estate broker. Obviously, there's going to be more value. And that consideration in and of itself shouldn't render the arrangement illegal as long as there's not a direct payment for referrals, just considering the value of placement in essence, which of course is important in any marketing or office campaign, where you're going to market your materials, how you're going to get in front of customers, how you're going to get in front of referral sources, whether it's going to be in person in your office or online, or even working with platforms that are digital marketing platforms. And that's another proposal that MBA stretches and really asks that advisory opinion regarding digital platforms that talks about non-neutral displays and non-neutral uses, and warns that the sale of exclusive leads, all of these things are in violation of RESPA, when that isn't what RESPA says. It's overreaching. So to simply let's throw that out, there's already a circular out there that talks about unfair and deceptive practices in digital marketing platforms. So let's just apply the laws that are already there. And why try to build something that's not based in the statute? So I think that's another really important piece. They also, just looking at it, another big area that they talk about is affiliated business arrangements. And clearly this is one that's getting a lot of attention, not just by the CFPB, but from state investigators and regulators and attorneys general. So this is another important point to talk about. And I think there are a lot of things here that require modernization. And really, it's not even modernization so much as just thinking back to the purpose of the law and tweaking the guidance there. So there are lots of principles regarding ABAs to try to clarify and eliminate provisions in the sham ABA tests that don't really make sense in this market, to make clear that just the opportunity to participate in this venture shouldn't be a problem, because the whole idea is to build business through referrals from owners and companies, and that shouldn't be prohibited. We're seeing a lot of state attention there to simplify the disclosures, to make them clearer for consumers, to give consumers the information they need to know, which is basically, hey, we're sending you over to an affiliate, so there's some self-interest here, without having to spell out in detail complex ownership structures.
Right.
And also to remove information regarding potential fees that might be in conflict with or unnecessary in light of the TRID disclosures. Because since RESPA was implemented, we now have binding LEs, which really changes the shopping experience for consumers and renders this unnecessary. Another thing, and maybe my favorite thing about the ask, is to get rid of e-sign consent for the affiliated business arrangement disclosure. A lot of our clients really struggle with how are they going to meaningfully disclose to consumers the affiliation when they're trying to quickly make referrals through online or social media platforms that don't lend themselves to e-sign consent? We know that the longer the customer experience, they're going to go elsewhere. They might check out because of our limited attention spans.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really a fan of that initiative as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right. How about desk rentals and that sort of thing? It sounds like generally things are going to be easier if this were adopted, or if some of its guidelines were at least brought forward and looked at
Right.
for
That's
serious
sort
adoption.
of the $64,000 question,
It
too.
is.
You know, it's interesting when we look at the proposal, and MBA recognizes this. There are a lot of bright people on MBA staff and the volunteers who led the charge that
Sure.
some of the things we'd like to do would require a change to RESPA. So that means Congress would have to act. And we all recognize that that's probably not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the changes that MBA proposes are regulatory changes, like by adding certain definitions regarding lead generators, adding definitions regarding marketers that create carve-outs and safe havens for things that are happening in the industry now that we think are outside of the intention of Congress and even the letter of law when RESPA was enacted, and as RESPA has been revised over the years.
Yeah.
Many of these things are regulatory changes, but a lot of them, like with desk rentals, and the changes that are proposed would go to modifying policy statements that HUD put in place in the 90s. Now, we know from many courts that these policy statements don't have the force of law, but at the same time, they're kind of all we've got.
Right.
And so at least if we could get some clarity there, because we know that those are tools that examiners still use when assessing the RESPA compliance of these arrangements, at least then that will make these laws a little more prescriptive and help practitioners and industry alike figure out where the guardrails are.
Well, and to your point, just would allow it also to evolve up to the modern way of doing business.
Right.
Yeah, because what with the last real kind of meaningful reform we had was like 08. And I don't know about you, but my work is very different than it was then.
Oh, yeah. And I'm trying to think of Section 8. I think that is true when things change relative to controlled business and ABAs.
Yeah.
So it is very different. And also just recognizing practical economic realities, coming up with general market value, which is what anyone would pay for space, or that doesn't take into consideration the value of that location. Like in any retail lease arrangements, there's usually, I understand, some kind of a share to the landlord based on the value of that space from a marketing perspective and targeting your customers and who the customer base is and the demographics in that area. And because of RESPA's prohibitions on paying for referrals and prohibition on fee splits, certainly we don't, and MBA doesn't expect that mortgage lenders would be able to share a part of their profits or pay a referral fee to a real estate broker landlord every time they got a loan or someone walked in the door. But at the same time, ignoring the value of being adjacent to a real estate broker space is preposterous. You should be able to pay more to be there because of the proximity to the real estate brokerage, to the agents, to referral sources, to captive audience of people who are ready to buy a home and great candidates, as opposed to being in the dentist's office. And the same with marketing. Having your marketing collateral in a space where you have folks that are ready to buy is far more valuable than if you're going to be in the dentist's office. Or I always thought, and I remember talking with HUD about the idea of exclusivity, and this isn't really touched on in the policy statement, but I think that it could be expanded from the white paper and the same tenets, and that just thinking about how people market and the value. And we know that HUD and then the CFPB hate exclusivity, and we saw over and over in consent orders that you can't have exclusivity in a marketing service agreement. But think about when you're paying to market, if you're a mortgage lender and you're marketing with your collateral in the real estate broker's office and a home buyer walks in, and if your sign is the only sign there, it's much better and more valuable to you than if there are 20 take ones. And HUD didn't care. And I don't think the CFPB did either, but that should be important. And that same concept carries over to this idea about digital marketing platforms. What would you be willing to pay for? Like to be on the top of the list, to have a bigger ad. We think it's okay to pay based on pixels or space. And those concepts all make sense. We know that in a newspaper, you pay more to be above the fold than below the fold. And as long as consumers aren't being misled, then that should be okay under RESPA. RESPA doesn't talk about that. And there's certainly ways that we can protect against misleading messages or the impression that someone's being listed at the top for some reason that isn't really right and true when it's really just they're paying for it without running afoul of RESPA. The fact that you're paying more to be at the top of the list doesn't mean you're paying for referrals. And that's what RESPA prohibits. And it's preposterous to think that.
Right. It is. And you get quickly back to that old argument of, well, if your marketing's ineffective, it's probably RESPA compliant. But if it's effective, if you get leads from it, it might not be. I mean, I know that's not the case, but that's kind of the old joke.
That's right. And, I think about talking with regulators when the value under an MSA would change. Or if we all say as a best practice or rule of thumb, when you're drafting a marketing services agreement, it shouldn't be month to month. You should have at least a 6-month term. Maybe you have a 60-day termination. But think about any other marketing campaign. If it's not working, you're going to pull the plug on it.
Right.
So it's silly to build these constructs and prohibitions that don't exist in the law and that don't make economic sense. And they're clearly not. That doesn't mean that you're paying tied to referrals. It's just you're not paying when something isn't working.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point. Well, and it's not as though there aren't established metrics and ways for doing this in the attention economy, the advertising-based economy that has grown up digitally since the last time any of this was opened up and looked at. It's not as though you'd have to reinvent the wheel. You might have to put, to your point, your subtle point, I think, of a few extra little disclaimers or protections or whatever.
Sure.
They're not listed the biggest because they're the bestest or have the highest, consumer rating on Yelp. But to pretend that to approach everything as if it's all kludged up when literally every other industry has sorted this out, and to be kind of prohibited from sorting it out in a market-based way is it's hobbled us a little bit. And I get my back up on this a little bit because we, in the title side of things, not so much the lender, but in the title side of things, we get beat up for being antiquated, for not being digital first, to, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, but not that that's the sole reason, but it is a contributing factor, I think, because the rules get very kludgy out there.
Right. Well, and we see title gets a lot of attention too because it's more complex and harder for consumers to really understand the benefits and the benefits to themselves. And God bless title. I feel for them because they're under attack always. I always under attack and challenged about the need for title or claims rates or claims payments.
Right.
And, gosh, it's probably the only industry that's more regulated than mortgage lending is insurance, right? So it's not like no one's minding the store and no one's paying attention. There are tons of consumer protections built into insurance. So, and on the RESPA side, it is unique. It's different. Title's different than mortgage in how you market your services or how title providers are generally going to want to market to referral sources as opposed to direct to consumers. Now, companies, mortgage brokers, mortgage lenders also are more likely to want to market to referral sources because you get more bang for your buck necessarily than consumer direct. And that's another thing that has sort of tied the hands of anyone trying to pay on a marketing services agreement because the CFPB has indicated in its guidance that you really need to be looking at marketing to consumers or to the general public. And the law doesn't say that. And I think the industry has continued to pay for marketing in other forums, whether it's internal sales meetings at real estate brokerages, if it's even like open houses, which I would assert is still to the general public, although I've heard of examiners at the CFPB saying, well, that's not really the case. That's not really open to the public. Now, anyone who's gone to their neighbor's house out of nosiness, right, at the open house, knows that's open to the public. So, that's sort of different than general public. Like, can you only pay for a billboard? That's ridiculous. There are lots of other ways that people market themselves. And the way the definitions in RESPA are drafted, if you were just an outsider coming to this and looking at the language in the law, you would not think it's prohibited to pay marketing to middlemen or referral sources. And that's another goal of the MBA's mission, is to try to really pull RESPA Section 8 prohibitions back to what the law says, and to retract all of these expansive interpretations, whether through advisory opinions, interpretive rules, consent order proclamations with no basis in the law, and just ways to scare the industry.
Have you seen anybody intentionally dilute their marketing to sale capture rate by just adding in some random advertising to consumers to make their success rate of being in the important places that actually convert to sales? Because that's part of the deal, is what's your capture rate? Oh, that's too high. That's suspect.
No, I don't know. I don't think people have done that. I don't think so. It's very difficult to come up with these valuations.
Right.
There's really only one game in town for the valuations, and it's based on metrics they're constructed based on reasonable comparables. They were examined by the CFPB many moons ago in connection with their examination of an independent mortgage lender that was very active in the MSA space.
Yep.
And because of that, I think it gave the industry comfort that is an appropriate provider of valuation services, and rightfully so, because I can tell you that I've shopped for others to value services on behalf of our clients, and even when we could find anyone who would bite at it, every metric that they knew to employ, and other metrics, other valuations I've seen from clients, they of course take into consideration ROI, because that's part of what you consider. It's the stickiness of your campaign, whether you're buying leads or you're placing ads or you're, whatever it is, buying a billboard. If you're engaged in co-marketing, you want to see, is this investment returning business to us,
right,
bringing business to us? Otherwise, why would you do it?
Right.
So it's very challenging, and there's even chatting at conferences from former regulators. I don't know if current regulators, the CFPB has said it about, well, now that there's only one game in town, is that even like the right way to value these services? So all of this uncertainty around valuation. We saw some enforcement in California about lead generation in the home warranty space, data purchases. If you're simply buying data from someone, why should you have to value that if there's no referral, right? Now, oftentimes, of course, the people who are selling the data are people in a position to refer, so that complicates things.
Right.
But it would be nice if we had something that's simpler. So as long as there's no evidence that there is compensation tied to referral of business, and as long as there isn't compensation for the endorsement, which is what the MBA seeks to define, then we shouldn't have to have it be so vague and complicated.
Right. Right. You touched on a couple things that I want to circle back to and kind of elevate again. But in your experience, where does the most confusion of how to comply with RESPA come from? And if I would like to ask you, where does the most confusion come in with regard to the regulated entities? And where have you, in your opinion, seen the most confusion when it comes from the regulators themselves trying to enforce?
Okay. So I guess first, in the marketing and advertising space, I think there's a lot of confusion about, first, which types of services are okay. And just at a very fundamental level, from regulators and the regulated, they just think referrals are prohibited. And of course, referrals are not prohibited.
Right.
What's prohibited is an agreement or understanding for a thing of value to be paid in connection with the referral business. So folks can refer all day, but as long as they're not getting a thing of value for that and there's no agreement, which can be, if there's an agreement, can be proved very easily by a pattern or practice. We've seen enforcement even for one thing of value once. There's not a pattern or practice. And then, somehow there's an agreement or understanding. So there's a lot of confusion on the regulator side that whenever they see a thing of value going to a referral source, that there's automatically a RESPA
strap on the red light. Woo!
Yeah. I think that's the first, the biggest source of confusion on the regulator side.
Okay.
And I think that there's also confusion with regulators and the industry about co-marketing versus paying for marketing services. So when parties are marketing themselves together, then the appropriate way to assess that arrangement is by shared expenses, sharing the costs of the ad, versus when I'm paying someone else to market me. So that's a different thing. So in that context, what types of things are okay? How do you value them? And then also importantly, do you have to disclose them? Because as a technical matter under RESPA, there is no disclosure requirement related to a marketing service agreement or a lease arrangement, or when a settlement service provider pays anyone for marketing services, whether it's a settlement service provider like a real estate broker, or if it's a financial planner or the pastor at their church or the PTA at their school. You can buy ads in all those places. There's no statutory requirement for a disclosure, but all day, every day, I see people combining their affiliated business arrangement disclosures with their MSA disclosures put in there. And from a strict reading of the law, you can't combine that ABA disclosure with anything else. So while certainly we suggest that parties have a notice of business relationship and incorporate that into their practices to the extent that it's meaningful and can get in front of consumers, that, hey, we're paid to market folks and we don't get paid. You can use anyone you want, and we're not paid based on the amount of business that we send, but just so you know, we're paid to market folks. And I think that's prudent to avoid an unfair, deceptive act or practice, whether it's under federal law or state law.
Right.
So there's a lot of confusion about that. And then on the affiliated business arrangement side, oh my gosh. I think right now the biggest source of confusion for regulators is that the mere opportunity to participate in this venture is in and of itself a RESPA violation. You know, the fact that I'm going to invite you, Mary, as a shareholder in my mortgage or my title venture because you have a huge sphere of influence, and I'm not going to invite my dentist, shouldn't render the arrangement illegal. And one of the 3 conditions to the safe harbor is that the only thing of value the parties receive from the arrangement is a return on their ownership interest or some other RESPA compliant compensation. And because of these expansive interpretations of regulators that are disgusted with the fact that a referral source can buy into a new venture at a relatively low amount, and that investment is going to grow as the business grows, is deemed to be problematic, is absurd, because they should be getting the return on their ownership interest because they're bearing the risk. You know, they don't all thrive.
Right.
We wish that they all had high capture rates. And in this market, we're aware of folks that have ABAs that are in the red.
Yes.
So it's not always the case that they're going to be thriving, and that those folks who are investing capital in a new venture are going to profit. And because of this idea that the return on the ownership interest is somehow not warranted, we're seeing operating agreements being drafted so that when a party exits, all they get is their initial investment. And that isn't right. Certainly, if it's in the red, they shouldn't get their initial investment because it's a windfall. But if it's worth more, they should get more. And that's another point that the NBA makes. The point that just the mere opportunity to participate in the venture. And, you know, I've heard consumer advocates say, well, you know, they're not asking me to be in the venture. Well, there are lots of closely held businesses that we're not all being invited to participate in. And as long as the entity is in fact appropriately capitalized and everybody antes up, there's no reason that every single owner shouldn't bear the risks and rewards. As the business ascends, so should their share of value.
Okay. Another but related topic on this subject. So we expect to see state enforcement have a renaissance. We saw District of Columbia, which obviously the RESPA, as we know, is a floor, not a ceiling. Some of their interpretations go a little bit beyond RESPA. I would shout out Indiana, maybe in the past, has had some interesting interpretations, but do you expect to see more happening at the state level? And do you expect them to sort of pick up and do RESPA Plus in their worlds, or just kind of stick with garden variety RESPA enforcement? Or what would you wager there if you were a gambling woman?
Gambling women. Well, a lot of compliance and litigation firms are taking a chicken little approach. The sky's falling and all the states are running in. And some of the states are saying, hey, we're here, we're ready to step in. And I think a lot of that is perhaps politically motivated. I think the pendulum might swing a little, but I don't think it's going to be that extreme. I think states have been out there. Some are more active than others in looking at RESPA Section 8 compliance. I've seen many a regulator jump to the conclusion, state regulator, that and investigate when they see RESPA compliant advertising and marketing campaigns, that they just jump to the conclusion that there's a violation, and they've been pretty aggressive, oftentimes behind closed doors, in investigating those, shutting them down, threatening CFPB action. I think that we've seen little public enforcement of that, but we've seen all kinds of tire kicking over the years, as much as folks looking at really a cup of coffee. We've seen social media campaigns that have resulted in administrative enforcement actions where lenders and title companies have had either shut down or they've had to cease their MSAs. They've had to retool their marketing campaigns. They've had to do extensive training for their teams. They've had to pay penalties. They've had repeat examinations. So I think that especially from the mortgage regulators on the state side, many states have been very active. And I think that certainly in the ABA space on the title side, states have been active, and that was pretty contagious for a while. But I think it's settled down some. But I think it would be imprudent for anybody who's involved in affiliated business arrangements to ignore the 10-factor test. In the sham policy statement from 96 from HUD, I think states do look to that, and that you should have established some legitimacy that your affiliated business arrangement, whether it's in the mortgage space or in the title space or in the insurance space, really is acting the way independent players would act without ABAs. And that is hard, and that's part of what we see in the MBA policy statement is people don't operate now in offices with dedicated employees. Right. A lot of people operate now in a world where people are virtual, it's a gig economy. You work with independent contractors. Technology fills many of these functions and roles. I don't think it's ever been appropriate to require affiliated business arrangements to go out and capture business from referral sources other than their own owners. There's nothing in the law that requires that. And why is that somehow nefarious? It shouldn't be. I don't see states looking so much at that. And if that is an area of concern about controlled business, as a longtime expert in the title space, lots of states have limitations on controlled business for affiliated business arrangements in the title space. We don't see that so much in the mortgage side, or concerns if you don't want certain types of participants in the business, then you can do that through other means, through the state legislature. And that's really what DC did. DC gave some play to RESPA, but at the end of the day, they hung their hat on their anti-inducement statute. Now, I think inappropriately based on a strict reading of that law, but it wasn't really all related to RESPA. And there are lots of laws out there that limit affiliated business arrangements. There are laws that limit how parties market themselves, how they pay people in positions to refer. There's plenty of that states could look at without getting in the RESPA business. And for AGs, does this have a lot of play? I don't know. I just can't believe that RESPA Section 8 is that sexy. There's so many bad things going on in the world that I don't know. So maybe we'll see some more tire kicking, but I'm not really believing that they're all going to come running in force to fill the void of what the CFPB was doing, because realistically, what the CFPB could do in this space was very small. They're a risk-based organization. When they're targeting their investigations, a lot of what they were doing was behind closed doors, so we didn't know. They were issuing these proclamations and consent orders and bulletins and blasts and blogs and things to scare us.
And bleats, yeah.
Yeah, right. You know, because you're reporting on
yeah.
keeping up with it all. It's hard to keep up.
It is.
And a lot of that doesn't have the force of law, but it's all still out there. So I don't think it's going to be as extreme as all that.
I think there's going to be a lot of fresh activities. I think there's going to be a lot of folks trying to get a new bite at an apple to make sure that what things don't fall through. And I do agree with you federally for sure that, yeah, the music's going to run for a while and we're not going to be too sure where everything's going to end up. But at the end of the day, I don't know that we're going to see much change. I don't know, though. Everything's changing like every couple of hours. So I do know that trying to remain compliant with what was true 8 weeks ago that is now no longer true. We're watching these cases get pulled down by, and so it's like, okay, we didn't know, we didn't have an outcome on that, but we were gunning for it and we were watching it and we were positioning it, and then they get pulled down. So that's been a lot of the coverage right now is, oh, this was a thing, it's not a thing anymore. Oh, this was a thing, it's not a thing anymore. And I feel sorry especially for those in industry who have had to comply with a lower, somewhere along the way, have spent money, invested in being compliant, and then the definition of compliance just changes overnight. That's what's so hard about this. For those that view this as a corrective period more than just a chaotic period, that's the hard part is you invest to be compliant. All the good businesses want to be compliant, but when that definition changes, and it's not just because the administration changed. I mean, we were getting that within the same administration sometimes too. It's not a big admonition of one tribe or another. It's just that business expense when the market is smaller right now. To a subtle point you made earlier, we have more folks interested in JVing with us because their revenues are down too. Well, so it's smaller pie, and then carve up more pieces of the pie. And then when you add this price of comporting to a compliance that changes frequently, it's just, people are just taking on water right now. It's, as you well know, it's a very difficult time.
Right. Well, and I think the hardest part is, and this is always a question for our clients, the law only says these things. Here's what the law prohibits, or here's what the law requires. But here's the best practice, and here's the administrative guidance, and here's how to best mitigate your risk. And here's this whole spectrum of choices you can make based on your risk appetite.
Right.
And it's very challenging when you're trying to keep your doors open and you see competitors who are paying cash in a brown paper bag, let alone maybe they are just complying with the statute and not all these guidance documents.
Right.
And so it's very difficult to assess the risk because, you have to have a door to knock on.
You do.
And so I try to be practical with our clients about, I think this is reasonable. I could look a regulator in the face and defend this. If it were my business, I'd be comfortable with this. This thing, I'd run for the hills, or here's how to mitigate that risk. And it is really challenging because, as we know, even if you're right, simply responding to an investigation can be cost prohibitive. That could be enough to force $500,000 settlement, $1 million settlement, because you've already spent that much in document production costs and bad will and reputational risk and negative juju with your team and bad karma or whatever it is.
Right.
So it's really hard to think about how you're going to compete with people who aren't as buttoned up as you are, and deciding where are you willing to draw that line. And it's really tough.
It's very tough. All right. I got three questions for rapid fire. Ready?
Oh, rapid fire. Okay.
Rapid fire. Ready?
Yes.
If you were queen for a day and you could make one change to RESPA, either that is included in the MBA's proposal or not, what would you do? What would you change?
Just get rid of Section 8.
Just altogether?
Yeah.
Say more.
Well, I think that why shouldn't you pay someone for referrals as long as consumers know? We know disclosures aren't really that effective, but would it really drive up settlement costs when consumers can shop anyway? For me to say, you should deal with Mary, if I'm a real estate agent, I'm not going to give you the name of someone who does a bad job.
And I'm not going to encourage you to go to the interweb and find that bad job person yourself because you don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess, obviously it's rapid fire, so I didn't think it through, but
No,
I
you're
think
right.
that's probably the best thing. And as far as fee splitting and fleet sharing, rest of Section 8B doesn't get that much play. And again, why would someone give up their money unless there's some benefit? I think we can protect against these controls through UDAPs.
Okay. Well, queen for a day.
Yeah,
Section 8
I
gone.
have my little crown.
I like, oh, good.
It's a very small
So let
crown.
it be written. So shall it be done.
Let it be.
Okay, could be RESPA related or not, but what's one thing that's like sort of on your radar screen that you're just monitoring that you haven't talked about hugely widely yet?
It's coming down the pike?
That you're watching, yeah. What's got your Antilli interested right now?
Well, I think AI is fascinating. And how, Colorado just kicked off, rushed their law through to be the first in the water. And it's very challenging in light of how many things we've already done in an automated way, which haven't been deemed to be nefarious,
right?
And how that might develop. I think it's fascinating.
And every regulator, I agree with you. And every regulator that I've talked to since AI really, it's been a year and a half, couple years now, I go, how do you audit an algorithm? And they go, I have no idea. Yeah. And I don't mean that just in a scary way. Like, how do you say it's a good decision engine, a bad decision engine? What went into it? They have no idea. So the outcomes, the use of it's one thing, and it's going to change the way we work. But from a regulator standpoint,
it's the whole thing. Even when we've been thinking on the fair lending side. All right, if you're hiring people to do these things, you need to know what's in the black box. But who knows what's in the black box? And then where are you going to give up your trade secrets? And it just raises a lot of really interesting questions. And obviously, it can be used for good as well as evil. So it'll be fun to see where it leads.
Well, so it sounds like a lot of good things in this RESPA reform proposal that would be nice if they were taken up. They probably won't be taken up to any big degree, but there's no scary gotchas in there. It doesn't sound like if it's evolved, business will probably go along pretty well.
Yes, I think we should all spread the word. Let's spread the word to get some play because it's going to take a long time to move the needle. Look how long it took us to get TRID.
Right.
I started working on that when I was in-house and working through a committee at NEHEMA. Gosh, that was 1992 maybe.
Yeah.
Thought it might never happen, and it did. And so I feel like this will happen, and it's just a matter of getting the message out there and making some noise and getting folks to pay attention. So hopefully we will.
Awesome. Well, our as we mentioned at the top, our gal RESPA is 50 years old. So happy birthday, but it's time for a facelift or two, we hope.
Right on.
Loretta, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Always a treat to be with you.
You too. Thanks again, Loretta, for helping us rethink how an updated RESPA might come to serve our modern market more effectively. Now, audience, if you'd like to continue the conversation with Loretta, her email and website are linked in today's show notes. She'd love to help you sort out your RESPA questions. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, I'm Mary Schuster for October Research, where knowledge will always be the competitive advantage.